Have you ever wondered why some people just don't believe in God? I mean, we all know someone like that, right? Someone who confidently says, "There's no God," or, "Faith is just a crutch for people who are afraid to face reality." Maybe it's a friend, a colleague, a famous scientist, or even you. Atheism. The belief that there is no God, no higher power, nothing beyond what we can touch and see, is more common than you might think. In fact, in many parts of the world today, being an atheist is seen as intellectual, sophisticated, even courageous. But here's a question for you. What could possibly make a person who has built their whole life on reason and skepticism suddenly believe in God? What kind of moment, what kind of experience, would be powerful enough to flip their entire worldview upside down? Today, we're diving deep into this fascinating and emotional topic, the stories of atheists who became believers. And not just any believers, people who went from mocking faith to defending it. From arguing against God to dedicating their lives to Him. You might be surprised to hear that some of these people are not just random individuals. We're talking about world-renowned scientists, hard-nosed journalists, famous philosophers, people who, at one point, dedicated their lives to proving religion wrong. So why? Why did they change their minds? Was it an emotional crisis? Was it a near-death experience? Was it love? Was it science itself? And maybe more importantly, what can we learn from them? You see, no matter where you stand on the faith spectrum, whether you're a firm believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, there's something deeply human about the search for meaning. We all, at some point, ask the same questions. Why am I here? What happens when I die? Is there more to life than just waking up, working, paying bills, and sleeping? Maybe you've never really thought about it. Maybe you've pushed those questions to the side because they feel uncomfortable or because life is just too busy. But for the people we're going to talk about today, these questions were impossible to ignore. And when they finally faced them head-on, their lives changed forever. Some of them had everything the world says we should want: money, fame, success, but still felt an emptiness they couldn't explain. Others were in the depths of pain and loss, searching for a light in total darkness. Some simply followed the evidence wherever it led, even if it meant going against everything they had ever believed. These stories aren't meant to convince you of anything. They aren't here to tell you what to believe. They're here to open a window into the hearts and minds of people who dared to ask, "What if I'm wrong?" So, as you listen, I want you to keep an open mind. Imagine yourself in their shoes. Feel their struggles, their doubts, their fears, and their incredible moments of transformation. Because maybe, just maybe, at the end of this video, you'll walk away not with all the answers, but with a new perspective. Maybe you'll see faith not as something weak or naive, but as something deeply human, maybe even necessary. Alright, are you ready to dive in? Let's explore what happens when the most unlikely people find themselves face to face with the divine. Before we get into the stories of people who changed their minds, let's take a moment to understand why people become atheists in the first place. Because, nobody wakes up one day and just randomly decides, "I don't believe in God." For many, it's a journey, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, but always personal. Let's start with the most obvious reason: science. In school, we're taught to rely on evidence, to question everything, to demand proof before we believe something. And that's a good thing. Science has given us incredible advances: medicine, technology, space travel. It teaches us to think critically and not accept things just because someone says so. But for some people, this devotion to evidence becomes a wall that blocks out anything they can't measure or test. If it can't be seen under a microscope or explained by physics, then it must not be real. Think about it. The universe is so vast and complicated. The idea of a higher power or a creator feels almost too big, too mysterious. Some people find comfort in believing that everything can be explained by natural laws, no surprises, no mysteries, no higher purpose pulling the strings. Then there's pain. This one is huge. A lot of people turn away from faith because of deep personal suffering. Maybe they lost someone they loved. Maybe they went through abuse, betrayal, or serious illness. And in those moments of darkness, they asked, "Where was God when I needed Him?" It's a fair question. It's a painful question. And for many, It's a question that leads them to conclude, if there really was a loving God, He wouldn't let this happen. You might have heard stories of someone who prayed desperately for a miracle that never came. Or someone who grew up in a strict religious family where faith was used as a weapon, a tool for control instead of love. These experiences can push people far, far away from religion. And then there's the culture factor. In some places, especially in modern Western societies, religion is seen as outdated or even dangerous. People grow up surrounded by media and educational systems that tell them faith is irrational, that believers are weak-minded, or that religion is just a source of conflict and violence. Imagine being a young person in college. You're surrounded by professors and peers who laugh at religion, who treat it like a fairy tale for people who can't handle reality. If you don't have a strong foundation or supportive community, it's easy to feel embarrassed or pressured to leave faith behind. Another big reason? The desire for freedom. Let's be real. Believing in God often comes with moral expectations. You're called to live a certain way, to put others first, to make sacrifices. And, honestly, that's hard. Some people just want to live life on their own terms, no guilt, no rules, no higher authority telling them what's right or wrong. It's tempting to think, if I reject God, then I'm truly free. No one to answer to. No cosmic judgment day. Just me, my choices, and whatever I decide is right for me. And let's not forget intellectual pride. Some people are so smart, so educated, that they believe they've outgrown the need for faith. They might see religion as something for the uneducated or the simple-minded. After all, they've read all the books, studied all the philosophies, and they know better, or at least, they think they do. For them, admitting the possibility of God feels like weakness, like surrendering, and surrendering is the last thing they want to do. But here's the thing. Behind every atheist, there's a story, a reason, a wound, a set of experiences that shaped their view of the world. Some atheists are gentle souls who simply couldn't reconcile what they saw in the world with the idea of a loving God. Others are fighters, rebels against authority and tradition. And some are seekers who, ironically, might be closer to faith than they think, because they're already asking the hard questions. It's easy to stereotype atheists as cold or arrogant. But the truth is, many are deeply thoughtful people. They've wrestled with questions that most of us are afraid to ask. They've faced the silence, the darkness, and decided to stand on their own. And yet, even in the most convinced atheists, there's sometimes a tiny whisper in the heart. What if I'm wrong? What if there's more? That whisper might come late at night when the world is quiet and the distractions fade away. It might come during a tragedy, when all the logic in the world can't comfort a broken heart. Or it might come during a moment of breathtaking beauty, a sunrise, a piece of music, a newborn baby, when something inside says, there has to be more than this. Not every atheist will listen to that whisper. Some will ignore it forever. But some will start a journey they never expected. And those are the people we're going to meet today. People who went from saying, God is a myth, to, God is my everything. People who thought faith was for the weak but discovered it takes more courage to believe than to doubt. People who lost everything and found something greater in the ashes. Their stories are not about easy answers. They're about struggle, honesty, and transformation. And no matter what you believe, there's something in these stories for all of us. Alright, let's dive into our first story. One of the most famous cases of a scientist whose faith journey shocked the world. Chapter 1. Francis Collins, the scientist who heard a bigger melody. Our first story is about a man who might surprise you, Dr. Francis Collins. You might have heard of him. He led the Human Genome Project, the massive scientific effort to map all the genes in human DNA. He's one of the most respected scientists alive today. A brilliant mind, a lover of data, logic, and hard evidence. Growing up, Francis wasn't raised with strong religious beliefs. In fact, as he got older and dove deeper into science, he saw less and less need for faith. The more he learned about biology, chemistry, and physics, the more he felt he could explain the world without invoking God. In his early career, he considered himself an atheist. He thought that belief in God was just an emotional crutch, something people invented because they couldn't handle the harsh realities of life and death. But then, Life started asking him questions he couldn't answer with science. While working as a doctor, Collins spent a lot of time with patients facing life-threatening diseases. He saw them wrestle with their mortality, with pain, with the reality of death. Some of them, even in the darkest moments, had an unshakable peace, a light in their eyes that he couldn't explain. One day, a patient looked at him and asked, "Doctor, what do you believe?" That question hit him like a punch to the gut. He realized he had never truly thought it through. He had just assumed that because he was a scientist, he didn't need to believe. But he hadn't actually investigated the evidence for faith the way he had for science. Curious and unsettled, he started reading. He picked up C.S. Lewis' book Mere Christianity, a classic that lays out rational arguments for belief in God. Collins expected to dismiss it as nonsense. But instead, he was shocked. He found the arguments compelling. The idea that our sense of right and wrong points to something beyond us. That the universe's order and fine-tuning might not be an accident. That love, beauty, and moral law hint at a greater author. He started to see that science and faith didn't have to be enemies. In fact, they could complement each other. Science explains how things work. Faith can help answer why they exist at all. Collins described his moment of surrender not as an emotional breakdown, but as the most rational decision of his life. He saw faith not as blind belief, but as a leap that was consistent with the evidence he saw around him. He began to see the elegance of DNA, the language of God, as he calls it, as a signpost pointing to something beyond random chance. In 2006, Collins wrote The Language of God, a book in which he publicly declared his Christian faith. He knew it would shock his colleagues and the scientific community. He even expected to lose some respect among his peers. But he felt he had to tell the truth of his journey. Since then, Collins has become a voice for those who feel torn between science and faith. He argues that you don't have to choose one or the other. You can be a rigorous scientist and still believe in a loving God. For Collins, faith wasn't a rejection of reason, it was the fulfillment of it. You can imagine the courage it took for a man at the peak of scientific achievement to say, "I believe in God." To many, it sounded like career suicide. But for Collins, it was liberation, a coming home to something he didn't even know he was missing. Think about that for a second. A man who spent his life analyzing the tiniest building blocks of life came to believe that those building blocks were designed with purpose and intention. He went from saying, "I have no need for God," to seeing God's fingerprint in every cell of our bodies. His story challenges us to consider that maybe, just maybe, science and faith are not locked in a boxing match. Maybe they're two ways of looking at the same incredible mystery called life. And if one of the smartest people on the planet can make that leap, what does that mean for the rest of us? What if faith isn't about turning off your brain, but about opening it even wider? Francis Collins's journey is just the beginning. Next, we'll meet a man who used to attack religion like a pit bull chasing a burglar, until his own investigation turned his world upside down. Chapter 2. Lee Strobel, the journalist who set out to disprove God. Our next story is about a man who might have been the last person you'd expect to ever believe in God. His name? Lee Strobel. Lee wasn't just an atheist. He was what you might call an angry atheist. He prided himself on his skepticism. He saw believers as people who were either weak-minded or simply naive. As a legal editor for the Chicago Tribune, Lee was a trained investigator. His entire career was built on digging up facts, exposing lies, and following evidence wherever it led, no matter who got hurt along the way. Life for Lee was going pretty smoothly. He had a successful career, a good marriage, and he was living exactly the way he wanted to. No God, no rules, no higher authority, just him, his intellect, and his freedom. But then something happened that threw a massive wrench into his perfectly controlled world. His wife, Leslie, became a Christian. Lee was furious. He felt betrayed. To him, it was as if she had joined a cult. He thought she'd lost her mind. He was terrified that faith would ruin their marriage, take away her independence, and turn her into someone he didn't recognize. But instead of becoming a rigid, judgmental religious fanatic, Leslie actually became more loving, more patient, and more compassionate. Lee was puzzled. He expected her to become closed-minded and uptight, but she became softer and more joyful. Still, he wasn't convinced, so he decided to do what he did best: investigate. Lee set out on a mission to disprove Christianity once and for all. He treated it like a legal case. He interviewed historians, theologians, medical experts, and scholars from all over the world. He dug into ancient manuscripts, examined archaeological evidence, and cross-examined every claim about Jesus. In his mind, he was sure he'd come out with all the ammunition he needed to show his wife and the world that Christianity was built on fairy tales and lies. But the more he investigated, the more uncomfortable he became. Instead of finding weaknesses, he kept finding unexpected strength. The historical evidence for Jesus's life, death, and resurrection was far more solid than he had ever imagined. The eyewitness accounts, the transformation of the disciples, the explosion of the early church, none of it made sense if it was all just a made-up story. Lee found himself backed into a corner. As a journalist, he had always prided himself on following the evidence, no matter where it led. But now the evidence was leading him to the last place he wanted to go: faith. After nearly 2 years of intense investigation, Lee finally had to confront the truth. In his own words, it would have required more faith to maintain his atheism than to accept Christianity. On November 8, 1981, Lee Strobel made the decision to give his life to Christ. He described it not as an emotional leap, but as a logical conclusion to a thorough investigation. His conversion completely transformed his life. His marriage, which was on the brink of disaster, was restored. His relationship with his children deepened, and he found a new sense of purpose and joy that he had never known before. Lee went on to write The Case for Christ, a book that details his journey from skepticism to faith. The book became a bestseller and was even adapted into a movie. Today, Lee Strobel travels around the world sharing his story, speaking to skeptics, seekers, and believers alike. He doesn't shy away from tough questions. In fact, he invites them. He knows exactly what it feels like to sit on the other side of the table, suspicious, critical, even hostile. And that's what makes his story so powerful. He didn't want to believe. He fought against it with everything he had. But in the end, the evidence he uncovered was stronger than his doubts. Lee's journey is a reminder that sometimes the walls we build around our hearts aren't as strong as we think. Sometimes, the very tools we use to keep faith out, logic, evidence, reason, are the ones that ultimately lead us straight to it. And so we have to ask ourselves, what would we do if the evidence pointed us somewhere we didn't want to go? Would we have the courage to follow it? Up next is a story that might be even more surprising. A man who spent his entire life arguing that God doesn't exist, only to shock the world in his final years. Chapter 3. Anthony Flew, the philosopher who shocked the world. If you had asked anyone in the academic world who was the most famous atheist philosopher of the 20th century, one name would have come up over and over again: Anthony Flew. For decades, Anthony Flew was a giant in the world of philosophy. He was known for his razor-sharp mind and his unwavering commitment to atheism. He debated theologians, wrote countless papers, and shaped the way many modern atheists argued against the existence of God. Flew's motto was simple: we must follow the evidence wherever it leads. That was his guiding principle throughout his entire career. And for most of his life, he believed the evidence pointed clearly away from God. In fact, in 1950, he wrote an essay called Theology and Falsification, which became the most widely reprinted philosophical article of the last century. In it, he argued that religious claims could not be tested or falsified, and therefore were meaningless. For years, Flew stood his ground. He became a hero to atheists around the world. He wasn't just another skeptic on the internet, he was the heavyweight intellectual champion of disbelief. But as he got older, Flew started to reconsider, and it wasn't because he had a sudden emotional crisis or a mystical vision. It wasn't because he wanted comfort or community. It was because of science. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, new discoveries in biology, physics, and cosmology started to pile up. The complexity of DNA, the fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants, and the sheer improbability of life arising by chance began to gnaw at him. Flew had always said he would go wherever the evidence led, and now, the evidence was leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. In 2004, at the age of 81, Anthony Flew made a stunning announcement. He no longer identified as an atheist. He said he had come to believe in a form of deism, the idea that some kind of intelligent mind must be behind the universe. To say that this caused a stir would be an understatement. The news spread like wildfire. Many atheists felt betrayed. They accused him of losing his mental faculties. They said he was manipulated. But Flew was clear. This was not an emotional decision. It was an intellectual one. He simply could not deny the mounting evidence for design in nature. He said, "I must go where the evidence leads." Flew didn't become a Christian, and he didn't align himself with any specific religion. But he left behind the rigid atheism he had defended for most of his life. In his book There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind, Flew detailed his journey and explained why he had to make this dramatic shift. He talked about the complexity of life, the origin of the universe, and the fine-tuning that seemed to point toward a designer. For Flew, this was not a surrender. It wasn't about fear of death or needing comfort. It was about integrity. He felt he would be dishonest to continue denying the possibility of a higher intelligence. You can imagine the courage it took to stand up in front of a world that had labeled you as the ultimate atheist and say, "I was wrong." Most people would rather die than admit they were wrong about something so fundamental. But Flew valued truth over reputation. His story forces us to wrestle with a tough question. What if the truth isn't what we want it to be? It's easy to hold onto our beliefs when they make us feel safe or superior. But what happens when new evidence challenges those beliefs? Are we willing to follow the evidence, even if it leads us into uncomfortable territory? Anthony Flew did, and in doing so, he shocked the entire philosophical world. His story is a reminder that faith and doubt are not static. We are all on a journey. Our beliefs can and do change, often in ways we least expect. Up next, we're going to meet a man whose transformation didn't come from intellectual arguments, but from an experience so powerful that it completely rewired how he saw reality itself. Chapter 4. Eben Alexander, the neurosurgeon who saw beyond the brain, approximately 800 words. Our next story is about a man who literally made a career out of studying the human brain, and believed, without a shadow of a doubt, that everything we are can be explained by neurons and synapses. Meet Dr. Eben Alexander. Eben Alexander was a respected neurosurgeon, a teacher at Harvard Medical School, and an expert in brain science. For most of his life, he believed that consciousness, our sense of being, of awareness, was nothing more than a product of the brain. When the brain dies, that's it, end of story. In his mind, there was no soul, no afterlife, no higher power. Everything could be explained through science. But in 2008, something happened that would completely turn his worldview upside down. Dr. Alexander contracted a rare and severe form of bacterial meningitis that attacked his brain. Within hours, he fell into a deep coma. His neocortex, the part of the brain responsible for thought, memory, and consciousness, was completely shut down. From a medical standpoint, he should have been experiencing nothing, just a blank, dark void. But according to Dr. Alexander, what he experienced was far from nothing. He described being taken to a realm beyond this world, a place filled with indescribable beauty, overflowing love, and an overwhelming sense of peace. He wrote about traveling through a valley of lush greenery, accompanied by a beautiful woman who communicated with him through thoughts and feelings rather than words. He felt deeply connected to the entire universe and encountered what he described as a divine, all-loving presence that felt more real than anything he'd ever known. After 7 days in a coma, a period during which his doctors had given up hope of recovery, Dr. Alexander miraculously woke up. Against all odds, he began to heal. As he regained his strength, he found himself utterly transformed, not just physically but spiritually. The biggest shock? His scientific mind could no longer explain what had happened. According to all the knowledge he had accumulated over decades, such an experience shouldn't have been possible. His brain was inactive. By all logical accounts, he should have had no consciousness at all. Yet he had vivid, powerful experiences that felt more real than this physical world. Dr. Alexander described this journey in his best-selling book, Proof of Heaven. In it, he argued that consciousness is not just a byproduct of the brain but something far greater, something that continues beyond physical death. Critics, of course, lined up to attack his story. Some accused him of hallucinating. Others suggested it was a desperate psychological defense mechanism. But Dr. Alexander was unfazed. He knew better than anyone what a brain in his condition should and shouldn't be able to do. And his medical records backed up the claim that his neocortex was completely shut down. For Dr. Alexander, the experience was not just a random vision. It was a direct encounter with the divine, something so profound and life-changing that he could never return to his old beliefs. Imagine dedicating your entire life to a worldview that says, this physical reality is all there is, only to have it shattered in an instant. Imagine standing at the intersection of science and spirituality, forced to admit that the reality you thought was solid might be only a small part of a much bigger picture. Dr. Alexander didn't become a religious preacher. Instead, he began sharing his story with the world, encouraging people to be open to the possibility that we are more than just physical beings. That love and consciousness might be woven into the very fabric of the universe. He spoke to people from all walks of life, skeptics, scientists, religious believers, and spiritual seekers. His story challenged everyone to question their assumptions about life, death, and what lies beyond, whether you believe him or not. His experience forces us to confront the possibility that there are things we don't understand, things that can't be measured, scanned, or dissected in a lab. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the mysteries are what make life richer, deeper, and more meaningful. Up next, we'll hear from a group of people who are less famous but whose transformations are just as powerful: artists, musicians, everyday people who found faith in the most unexpected ways. Chapter 5. Unexpected transformations, artists, musicians, and everyday skeptics. So far, we've talked about famous scientists, journalists, and philosophers. But these transformations aren't limited to public intellectuals. Some of the most powerful stories come from people you'd never expect: artists, musicians, and everyday skeptics who once mocked faith and then found themselves completely transformed. Let's start with Brian "Head" Welch, guitarist of the band Korn. If you know anything about Korn, you know they're famous for their dark, angry music, songs about pain, depression, and rebellion. Brian lived the ultimate rock star life: endless parties, drugs, women, money, fame. On the outside, he seemed to have everything he wanted. But behind the scenes, he was spiraling out of control. He was addicted to meth and other substances. And he felt empty no matter how many crowds screamed his name. Even his love for his daughter wasn't enough to pull him out of the darkness. One day, out of pure desperation, Brian went to church. It wasn't because he wanted God. He just didn't know where else to turn. During a service, he felt a presence he couldn't explain, something warm, powerful, and deeply personal. He described it as being completely overcome by love. Right there, he made the decision to leave drugs and walk away from his band at the peak of his career. Most people thought he was crazy, walking away from millions of dollars in worldwide fame. But Brian knew he had finally found something real. Something that all the success in the world couldn't give him: peace. Today, he still makes music, but now, it's about hope and transformation. He shares his story with addicts, struggling teens, and anyone who feels lost. And then there's Dave Mustaine, the founder of Megadeth. Dave was also living the rockstar dream. He was known for his aggression both on and off the stage. He had been kicked out of Metallica because of his substance abuse and violent behavior, which fueled a lifetime of anger and resentment. But after years of chaos and self-destruction, Dave hit rock bottom. In his autobiography, he describes falling to his knees and crying out to God. Even though he had mocked religion for years, he didn't know any prayers. He didn't have fancy words. He just said, "If you're real, help me." And slowly, things began to change. Dave found sobriety, rebuilt his relationships, and eventually declared himself a Christian. His faith didn't erase all his struggles overnight, but it gave him a foundation and a sense of worth he had never felt before. These transformations aren't limited to rock stars. Let's talk about everyday skeptics, people you and I might pass on the street without a second thought. Take Jennifer, for example. She was a hardcore atheist who loved debating Christians online. She thought faith was an intellectual cop-out, a sign of weakness. But when her mom died unexpectedly, Jennifer was crushed by grief she didn't know how to handle. In her despair, she started reading books about life after death, not because she believed, but because she needed hope. Slowly, she found herself drawn to stories of people who had experienced the presence of God in their darkest moments. Eventually, she went to a small church, mostly just to argue, but instead, she encountered a community that loved her without condition, that didn't try to win her over with arguments but simply sat with her in her pain. Over time, her intellectual walls began to crumble. She realized that faith wasn't just about logic, it was about love, healing, and connection. Or consider Mark, a self-proclaimed, militant atheist. He spent years ridiculing religion online, calling it dangerous and outdated. But after surviving a serious car accident, he had an overwhelming sense that he had been spared for a reason. He began questioning his deeply held beliefs and eventually found himself reading the Bible, a book he once used only as a punchline. The more he read, the more he felt a strange pull on his heart. One night, sitting alone in his apartment, he prayed for the first time, not even sure if anyone was listening. He described it as feeling like someone switched on the light in a dark room. Today, Mark shares his story online, reaching out to other skeptics who feel stuck between wanting to believe and being afraid to. What do these stories have in common? In each case, there was a moment of crisis, a point of desperation, or a sudden realization that life was more than just facts and arguments. These people weren't looking for religion. In fact, most of them were running as far away from it as possible. But in the end, something, or someone, caught up to them. These aren't fairy tales. These are real, messy, raw stories of real people. People who found faith not in a book or a lecture hall, but in moments of total vulnerability. Up next, we're going to step back and look at the common threads that run through all these journeys. What really makes someone change their mind about God? Let's dig deeper. Part 3. The common reasons behind their transformation. Approximately 1.200 words. Now that we've heard these stories, from scientists to musicians to everyday people, it's time to step back and ask, what really makes someone change their mind about God? After looking at so many journeys, some clear patterns start to emerge, and no matter who you are or what you believe, these reasons touch on the deepest parts of what it means to be human. Reason number 1. The experience of deep pain or loss. Let's face it, life can be brutal. The death of a loved one, a painful breakup, a health crisis, a financial collapse. These moments strip away all our illusions of control. For many atheists, pain is the final argument against God. If God is good, why would he allow this to happen? But ironically, for some, it's in these dark nights of the soul that they first sense something beyond themselves. When everything falls apart, we instinctively reach out for something bigger, something steadier than our fragile lives. It doesn't always lead to faith. Some people become more bitter. But for others, pain cracks open a door they had shut tight for years. Reason number 2. Near-death experiences and brushes with mortality. We heard this in Dr. Eben Alexander's story, but he's far from the only one. Near-death experiences, NDEs, are surprisingly common. People who were clinically dead or very close often report vivid visions, bright lights, tunnels, encounters with loving presences, even life reviews where they see how their actions affected others. Some skeptics dismiss these as brain chemistry tricks, but for many who go through them, the experiences feel more real than anything else they've ever known. Coming that close to death can rewire your whole understanding of life. Suddenly, arguments about religion feel small compared to what you felt when you thought you were leaving this world. Reason number 3. The search for meaning and purpose. Even in the most comfortable, successful lives, there's often an underlying question. Is this all there is? You can have the perfect career, beautiful family, all the toys and travel you could ever want, and yet still feel empty inside. Many atheists say they believe life has no ultimate purpose, that we're just advanced animals on a rock floating through space. But living as if there is no meaning is harder than it sounds. Over time, some people start to feel the weight of that emptiness. They crave something that gives their suffering a reason, their joy a deeper resonance, and their existence a higher calling. Reason number 4. The undeniable pull of love and community. One thing that comes up again and again is the experience of unconditional love. Atheists who come to faith often talk about being drawn in not by arguments, but by love, from a spouse, a friend, a community that didn't give up on them. Love has a way of breaking down the strongest intellectual defenses. You can argue with logic all day long, but it's much harder to argue with kindness, patience, and compassion. Many found that religious communities offered a kind of support and connection they had never experienced anywhere else. It wasn't about dogma, it was about being seen, accepted, and valued. Reason number 5. Evidence and intellectual honesty. Some atheists, like Lee Strobel or Anthony Flew, didn't have an emotional crisis, they simply followed the evidence. They looked at the historical evidence for Jesus, the fine-tuning of the universe, the complexity of DNA, and they found that atheism required more leaps of faith than belief in a creator. For them, it wasn't about feelings but about integrity. They realized that sticking to atheism would mean ignoring the data, and they just couldn't do that. Reason number 6. Personal mystical or spiritual experiences. Some people have spontaneous spiritual experiences, visions, dreams, moments of profound peace or unity with the universe. These experiences often come without warning and can't be explained away easily. Even if someone tries to rationalize it afterward, that initial shock of, there is something more, is enough to plant a seed that eventually grows into faith. Reason number 7. The moral argument, the problem of good and evil. Another reason people move toward belief is the realization that, without God, concepts like right and wrong become subjective. If we're all just random chemical reactions, why should we care about justice, mercy, or love? Why do we feel guilt or shame? Why do we admire courage and sacrifice? Many atheists turned believers say they realized their sense of morality felt too deeply ingrained to be just an evolutionary trick. It felt like a fingerprint of something higher, a moral lawgiver. Connecting the dots. When we look at all these reasons together, we see a powerful pattern. It's not usually just one moment or one argument that changes someone. It's a combination, an accumulation of experiences, questions, and small moments of wonder or doubt that finally break through. Some people resist these moments for years, even decades. Others give in quickly, but the journey is almost always messy, personal, and full of unexpected turns. And here's the truth. None of these reasons prove God in a scientific sense. But that's kind of the point. Faith, by definition, involves trust, stepping into something that can't be entirely captured in a test tube or an equation. Yet for many former atheists, faith wasn't about shutting off their brain. It was about opening it wider, to beauty, to mystery, to love, to the possibility that life is more than atoms and molecules. So, what about you? Have you ever felt a pull toward something greater? Have you ever wondered why certain moments of beauty or love make you feel a longing you can't explain? These questions don't have easy answers. But maybe, just maybe, they're worth asking. In the next part, we're going to take a look at some of the objections, the hard questions people ask when they hear these stories. Because if we're going to be honest, we have to look at both sides. Let's keep going. Part 4. Objections and the skeptic's side. Alright. So far we've shared some pretty incredible stories of transformation, healing, and unexpected faith. But if we're going to be fair and honest, we can't just ignore the other side of the conversation. Many skeptics and atheists have strong objections to these stories, and they raise questions that deserve to be heard. Because the truth is, faith is not just a one-way street, it's a dialogue. So, let's talk about some of the most common objections. Objection number 1. It's just emotional manipulation. One of the most common arguments is that faith conversions are driven purely by emotion, that people are vulnerable, scared, or lonely, and religion swoops in to offer comfort. And to be fair, emotion does play a huge role. When someone is at rock bottom, they're looking for hope, and religion often provides it. But here's the catch. Emotion doesn't necessarily mean falsehood. We don't dismiss love just because it's emotional. We don't say a parent's bond with their child is invalid just because it's deeply felt. Emotions can cloud judgment, yes, but they can also point us to truths that pure logic misses. Objection number 2. Near-death experiences are just brain chemistry. Skeptics often say that NDEs are the result of a dying brain releasing chemicals, creating hallucinations. It's a fair point, and there's no doubt the brain is capable of amazing and strange things. But many people who've had these experiences describe them as more real than anything else, and they often return completely changed, with new values and priorities. While science can describe some aspects, it hasn't fully explained why these experiences are so consistent across cultures and why they feel so vivid. It's an open question, and one that continues to challenge researchers. Objection number 3. Religious experiences are culturally programmed. Another argument is that people convert because of cultural pressure. If you're surrounded by believers, you're more likely to become one yourself. And yes, community and culture do have a big influence on us. But if that were the whole story, why do so many atheists convert even in secular environments? Why do people who actively oppose religion, like some of the people we talked about earlier, suddenly make a 180-degree turn? The fact that so many conversions happen against a person's prior beliefs suggests there might be more going on than just social conditioning. Objection number 4. It's intellectually dishonest. Some skeptics say that faith is basically shutting off your brain, that it's lazy thinking or an intellectual cop-out. But think about Lee Strobel or Anthony Flew. These were people who valued evidence above everything. They weren't looking for easy answers, they were dragged into faith almost kicking and screaming. For them, faith wasn't abandoning reason, it was the result of reason. It was about following the evidence, even when it led somewhere uncomfortable. Objection number 5. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. You've probably heard this famous line, and it makes sense. If someone claims something miraculous, we want solid proof. But here's where things get tricky. What counts as extraordinary evidence? If a person's life completely changes, if they give up addiction, find purpose, heal broken relationships, is that evidence? Or does evidence only mean laboratory results and mathematical formulas? This is a deep philosophical question, and in the end, each person has to decide what level of evidence is enough for them. The importance of honesty. Look, no one is saying these objections aren't valid. In fact, they're important. Healthy skepticism keeps us from falling into blind faith and superstition. But skepticism, like faith, can also become a shield. It can protect us from being vulnerable, from admitting we don't have all the answers, from opening our hearts to mystery. It's possible to be so afraid of being fooled that we miss out on something real and transformative. The best approach? Radical honesty, with ourselves, with the evidence, and with our deepest longings. Because at the end of the day, the question of God is not just a scientific puzzle or a philosophical debate. It's deeply personal. It touches on who we are, why we're here, and what happens after we're gone. It's okay to question. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to wrestle. In fact, some of the strongest faith journeys start with the toughest doubts. So, wherever you find yourself on this spectrum, firm believer, fierce skeptic, or somewhere in between, keep asking, keep searching, and most importantly, keep your heart open to wherever the evidence, and maybe something more, might lead you. In our final section, we're going to bring it all together. We'll talk about what these stories mean for us today and why these journeys matter, even if you don't share the same beliefs. Let's finish strong. Part 5. The conclusion and call to reflection. So here we are, at the end of this long, winding journey together. We've talked about scientists who saw God in the very DNA they studied, journalists who set out to destroy faith and ended up embracing it, philosophers who followed the evidence to places they never expected, rock stars who traded addiction and chaos for peace, and everyday people whose hearts cracked open in the middle of their pain. These stories aren't just about switching worldviews. They're about something deeper, about transformation, about waking up one day and realizing the universe might be more alive, more personal, and more meaningful than we ever dared to believe. Maybe you're listening to this and thinking, that's interesting, but it's not for me. And that's okay. Faith isn't something you can force. And it shouldn't be. True belief, if it ever comes, has to be deeply personal, freely chosen, and honest. But here's the thing. Even if you don't believe, these stories still have something to offer you. They invite us to slow down for a moment, To look past the endless scroll of social media, the noise of politics, the pressure to always be achieving and proving ourselves. To ask questions we usually avoid. What really matters in my life? Am I just existing day to day? Or am I living with purpose? Is there something, or someone, out there calling me to something greater? These questions can be uncomfortable. They can shake us, but they can also be the doorway to the most meaningful parts of life. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Honestly, no one does. Even the most devout believers have moments of doubt and confusion. And that's okay. Faith isn't a neat little package of easy answers. It's more like a lifelong conversation with ourselves, with others, and maybe even with God. Some people worry that faith means shutting off your brain or becoming blind to reality. But if you look at the stories we've shared, you'll see that these people didn't stop thinking, they started thinking even more deeply. They didn't stop questioning, they just asked even bigger questions. And in that questioning, they found something they didn't even know they were missing. Maybe for you, that something is still out there, waiting. Or maybe you're already on your own journey, quietly wrestling with doubts and hopes you've never told anyone about. Maybe you're afraid to even say it out loud. What if God is real? What would that mean for my life? It's a scary question, because if it's true, everything changes. But what if, beyond the fear, there's something beautiful waiting? A love so deep it can heal old wounds. A purpose so strong it can carry you through the darkest nights. A sense of belonging so real it feels like coming home. I don't know where you are today. Maybe you're sitting at home alone. Maybe you're on a long drive. Maybe you're out for a walk with headphones in, just trying to escape the noise. Wherever you are, I want to invite you, just for a moment, to be still. To let the stories you've heard sink in. To listen to that quiet voice inside that says, could this be true? You don't have to decide everything today. You don't have to have a dramatic, aha, moment or a sudden burst of certainty. Just be open, ask the questions, stay curious, and if you feel that tiny spark of curiosity or hope, follow it. Talk to someone you trust. Read a book from someone who's made the journey. Visit a place of worship if you feel comfortable, or just start with a simple, honest prayer, even if it's just, God, if you're real, show me. It might feel silly, but for so many people, that one vulnerable moment was the start of a brand new life. Before we wrap up, I want to thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end. I know this wasn't a short video, and these weren't easy topics, but I believe they're some of the most important questions we can ever ask. If this video resonated with you, if it made you think, if it sparked even the tiniest flicker of curiosity, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell your story. Ask your questions. Let's keep the conversation going. And if you know someone who might need to hear these stories, a friend who's struggling, someone who feels alone, or even someone who loves to debate, share this with them. You never know what a simple video might set in motion. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss future videos. We have a lot more deep dives and real-life stories coming your way. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and never stop searching.